Witam Państwa serdecznie na debacie zorganizowanej przez Fundację Paferę oraz Stowarzyszenie Koliber. Chcielibyśmy dzisiaj podyskutować o tym, czy sprawiedliwy handel w rzeczywistości jest sprawiedliwy. Do tego nawiązuje książka naszego gościa ze Stanów Zjednoczonych, profesora Wiktora Claara, profesora Uniwersytetu Henderson State University w stanie Arkansas, gdzie profesor naucza zasad ekonomii. Poza tym ukończył on również matematykę, jest współpracownikiem Instytutu Actona. Nie tak dawno napisał książkę o sprawiedliwym handlu, którą można nabyć w naszym sklepie fundacyjnym, gdzie kwestionuje zasady działania sprawiedliwego handlu, a naszym oponentem pana profesora będzie pan magister Borys Bińkowski, któremu bardzo dziękujemy za przybycie, ponieważ niełatwo było znaleźć oponenta dla pana profesora. Pan Bińkowski jest absolwentem Instytutu Krajów Rozwijających się Uniwersytetu Warszawskiego, a obecnie doktorantem na Uniwersytecie Wrocławskim. Specjalizuje się w zakresie studiów interdyscyplinarnych nad Afryką subsaharyjską, Jego badania ogniskują się głównie wokół wpływu zróżnicowania etnicznego na rozwój krajów Afryki. Bada pan Bińkowski również rozwój społeczności producenckich Fair Trade. Ponadto pan Bińkowski napisał krytyczną recenzję książki profesora Claara, o której wspomniałem. Więc zacznijmy może w ten sposób, że poproszę szanownych prelegentów o to, by zaprezentowali swój punkt widzenia na temat tego, czym jest tak naprawdę sprawiedliwy handel. So, Professor, let me start with the brief, maybe, definitions of fair trade of each of you. I would like to present it to Mr. Bińkowski as first, then Professor will answer, and I hope then we will have a very interesting discussion. So maybe let's begin.
Yeah, first I would like to thank you for invitation, and thank you for support. I don't think it would be so much hard to find an opponent for Mr. Claar, and the fact that this conversation will be in English may be a little bit difficult. Forgive me for my English. I'm sure it's far from perfect, and I'm a little bit not very fluent in this. But I hope along this conversation I will be better. So I will start with saying what the fair trade is, because it's always a problem, because I think it's one of the biggest disadvantages of the fair trade, that it's not easy to specify, to tell what the fair trade is. And when people who know something about fair trade are asked this question, their answer, it depends how much time they have. So if I have 5 minutes, I will try to be hurry. I will show just 2 images to let you know what the fair trade is. For me, the fair trade is firstly the kind of regulation, but regulation which is not state, which is not obligatory. It's not dependent on the state. I will tell about this regulation later. And the second is the idea to help poor people in developing countries, in so-called global south, to develop, to get a better life, not by sending them money, food, etc., but trade. is the motto trade, not aid. And what is important in fair trade, that it was established quite a long time ago, more than 50 years ago. And firstly, it was the handicrafts. Then after about 40 years of working with handicrafts, there were many organizations, like also Christian organizations, involved in the movement, especially in the United Kingdom, also in the United States, but also in other Western European countries. And then they realized that they can change the world the way they want by selling handicrafts. And they started to work with other goods, other commodities, like coffee. They started to work with tea, with bananas, with coca, with coca, good word, not coca, and with fruits, dried fruits, fresh fruits, many different commodities. And when they realized that to promote the selling, to help the selling, it is necessary to establish the mark, fair trade mark, this organization tried to create the central organization, and at least two of these central organizations are now very strong. One is Fair Trade International, so-called FLO, Fair Trade Labeling Organization, the owner of the mark Fair Trade. Another is World Fair Trade Organizations, WFTO, which mostly works with handicrafts. What else? What else is important? Now, right now we are seeing the third, I would say, step of changing fair trade movement, the fair trade revolution. Yes, the first one was to establish the movement. The second one was the changing from handicrafts to coffee, tea, etc. And the third, right now, is the making the movement, I would say, massive, big. So right now in the United Kingdom, there are steps to get big companies like Nestle to work with fair trade standards, and they started to changing the way the cocoa from Ivory Coast is produced. So right now we can buy in every store in the United Kingdom fair trade products. Along them the Nestle, I think, Kit Kat, and there is also a bar called dairy milk, something like this. The things which are not very well known in Poland. And what is sold now? I said coffee, I said tea, I said handicrafts, I said also about fruits, about bananas. We can buy bananas in Poland because selling it's a big business, and fair trade in Poland is very small. But for example, in many big stores in United Kingdom, you can buy bananas from, for example, Chiquita. They're all fair trade bananas, mostly organic. Where it is sold? As I said, in Western countries, the leader is United Kingdom. There is also United States, France, Germany, Austria, countries like Sweden, Denmark, and so on. In Poland, it's very small. I think the Czech Republic market is bigger than the Polish market. There are hundreds of organizations that are working with fair trade. there are hundreds of companies working with fair trade. Most of them small or very small, like mine. I mean, my wife company. Those people are not establishing one big company that represent them. They are not associated in very strong single movement, but there are many movements of fair trade. I would like to say right now about the Fair Trade International standards, because FLO is the body which certified fair trade products, most of the fair trade certified products. I would say, well, this is the sign. This is a sign of FLO, Fair Trade International. So if you see this sign on the product, you know this is the fair trade product, certified product by FLO, Fair Trade International. These are other examples of another fair trade certifications. This one is German, this one mostly German, Austrian. This one also guaranteed the organic production. And this is a sign of World Fair Trade Organization, which, as I said, is an organization mostly for producers of handicrafts. Along the FLO standards, there are some standards of production for small producers and for the biggest plantations. And they differ depending on which are we talking, or hired labor organizations or small producer organizations. Small producers like single farmer making coffee, cocoa, etc. And higher labor organization is usually a plantation or a small factory which can do tea or, for example, sport balls. But both of them has the same standards. And first of this, there are two kinds of standards. One of them is our financial standards, and another kind are non-financial. And to my big surprise, the non-financial standards are more important for producers, according to the researchers. And for them, the most important non-financial standards are long-term agreements. It means that producers has agreements for 3-4 years, and they can plan what to do. Another is the guarantee of the prepayment if it's necessary, up to about 50%. Another, which is not actually the standard of fair trade, but is opportunity of fair trade, is access to new markets, because fair trade creates the place where producers can sell products. And there are some standards which I could say there are social standards, like no child labor, no slavery, and payments not below minimum price in selected countries. And there are two fair trade financial standards. One is minimum price, and I could show you the graph for this. This is the price of the coffee between 2000 and 2011. As you see, the red line is the price of coffee, and right now it's very high. It goes very high, but in the 2002, from 2000 to more or less 2005, it was very low, sometimes lower than the cost of production. I think your book was written something in 2005, yes?
2009.
2009, later. Okay. These are the prices of the coffee. And you can see 3 lines that represents the minimum price. One of this is Flow International, the lower one, and 2 others are the minimum price standard for coffee of El Puente, this is the German organization, and the price for organic coffee. This is also something different. So this price here, in this period, in this period, guaranteed that these producers will have the minimum price, the price that guarantee them survival and something a little bit more. And right now, when the prices are very high, this is not so important. 2 words about another financial standard. It's a premium, fair trade premium, which is usually about 10% of the minimum price. Usually, because the premium depends on the product we sell, and this premium is given to the societies of the producers. Like, for example, there are producers making cocoa in Ghana, and they have hundreds of producers, but only few villages. So representatives of these villages decide how to use these payments. And usually it is or developing the production, like creating small factories, for example, to wash coffee and so on and so on, or to create to help children getting better education, like building schools, to help with health care problems, and it's like building, buying the car for sick people to get them to the hospital. And for example, in plantations and hired labor organizations, this is usually for the workers' security. For example, if they have an accident, they have security, they have the payment for the hospital and so on and so on.
Okay, maybe...
I'm about to finish.
Okay.
I think this is a finish.
And
Maybe
it's okay. It's a wonderful summary. So go right ahead, please.
for a summary.
You're doing a good job.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think this is the end, because I said about standards. I think I said everything. Maybe your questions will specify my answers, and Victor answers. Maybe you would like to add something to what I said.
Professor, could you comment on that, what we've heard, or give us other ideas behind the idea of the program of movement of fair trade?
Sure.
Go.
Thank you. And thank you for an excellent summary. It was very good. I really could not have summarized better myself, so I congratulate you. One of the reasons behind the growth of, and I'll speak mostly about coffee because it's the fair trade good that I know the best and that I've spent the most time researching. The other products you've mentioned, like bananas and sports balls, it's relatively recent, so I'll spend most of my time talking about the coffee market. The coffee market is also very important because as a commodity, like most commodities, the prices are extremely volatile. And it's a difficult thing to be a coffee grower because you never know exactly what the price of your coffee will be. You mentioned that today coffee prices are very high, in fact around 30-year highs today. And the reason is because of some bad weather in South America. and this is a pattern we've seen in the past. In the 1990s, there were 3 very high price spikes in the price of coffee. And there was frost in Brazil, drought, and those bad weather conditions created price spikes, very, very high global prices of coffee on commodity markets. And coffee, like most commodities, has a high variability in the price because, as an economist, I talk about supply and demand a lot, maybe too much. But the reality of the coffee market is that when prices fluctuate a lot, unlike other goods, consumers don't change the quantity of coffee they drink by very much. With many goods, if the price goes very low, we buy a lot. And if the price goes high, we don't buy as much. Coffee, we still obey the law of demand, as economists call it. Higher prices, we buy less. Lower prices, we buy more. But with coffee, we don't change very much our pattern. If the price of coffee goes very, very low, then all of a sudden I don't begin drinking 10 cups or 12 cups. I'd be very nervous and never get any work done. So if I drink 3 cups a day, but the price of coffee is very good, then maybe I don't change my buying pattern by much. And the opposite is true. If the price goes extremely high, people who drink maybe 2 cups of coffee a day or 3 cups of coffee a day, they still drink about the same number. And if they buy less, maybe it's just a little less. So we say that the demand side of the coffee market, the demand is very inflexible. And the same thing is true on the supply side. When the price of coffee is extremely high, like it is today, or like it was in the 1990s, normally sellers, when the price is very high, sellers race into a market and they want to supply more. The difficulty is that it takes some years between when the price rises for coffee growers to deliver additional coffee in the coffee market. I guess we can talk about details a little bit. There are 2 major kinds of coffee beans, Arabica and Robusta. And the Arabica beans are the ones that taste very mellow and very mild. They're grown mostly in South America, in countries like Colombia and Brazil, and they are very expensive. And when the price of coffee rises, like it did in 1990s or like it has today, growers of those Arabica beans would love to supply more, but currently, at that moment, they only have so much land allocated to coffee growing and so many plants. And so once the price rises, even if they begin immediately to plant more Arabica plants, it takes some 3 years until those plants are mature and they're able to yield new coffee beans for the market. So on the supply side, the law of supply still works. When the price rises, suppliers and potential suppliers, they want to respond to the high price by supplying more, but it's difficult in a short amount of time to supply very much more coffee. And the same thing is true when the price falls. Once you have many plantings, then those plants will yield coffee cherries for maybe 7, maybe 10 years, depending on the kind of bean. So it's very difficult in a short amount of time for sellers of coffee to either supply more when the price is high or supply less when the price falls. And so what it means for most coffee growers is extremely volatile prices, because when you combine demand that is not very sensitive to price changes, along with supply that is also not very sensitive to price changes, then what it means is that prices move around a lot. And we see this with many commodities. We see it with coffee beans, and we see it with the price of oil, very volatile prices. And in both of those cases, the reason is buyers aren't very responsive to changes in price, And sellers, even though they would love to be more responsive, it's difficult quickly to respond. So the pattern of prices for coffee is very predictable. Every time that prices go very, very high, then maybe 3, maybe 4, maybe 5 years later, prices fall low. Very, very, very low. Because when the prices were high, then existing coffee growers, and maybe some people who were not growing any coffee at all, they see the high prices and they get very excited and they begin to plant coffee, a lot more coffee. The best example of this was in the 1990s, those price spikes, when prices went very, very high because of bad weather in South America, like they have today. Vietnam expanded their coffee production quickly. And at the beginning of 1990s, the country of Vietnam grew almost no coffee. If you looked at a ranking list of the major coffee growers, Vietnam was not even on the list at all. But because the prices were so high in the 1990s, very poor people with no better choices saw those higher prices and began to plant coffee beans, Robusta beans, not the Arabicas, but the Robustas. And they did this because Robustas are, even though Robustas are less valuable, they're a good substitute for Arabicas. They're also used in instant coffee products like Café Pelé or Nescafé. And so poor people in Vietnam not growing coffee saw the higher price and it was very exciting. And so they began planting a lot more coffee. In fact, in decade of 1990s alone, Vietnam increased their coffee production by 1,400%, 1,400%. So in some years, by end of 1990s, they had gone from no one, a country that didn't grow coffee, to one that was right next to Colombia and Brazil in terms of total annual coffee production. And so the good news is that markets worked. People saw a high price for coffee, people who weren't growing coffee responded to the price signal, and they started to grow something that had a very high price. The bad news is, because Vietnam increased their coffee production by so much, so quickly, that by the end of the 1990s, as your picture shows, the global price of coffee fell very, very low to less than $1 per pound. So lowest it had been in decades. So the good news is, when prices go up, they're a signal to do more of something because it's valuable and it makes, in this case, growing coffee more attractive than the next best option. The bad news is, once you have made a serious investment in growing coffee, if you have, and hundreds and hundreds of other people have also, then that very large supply increase means that the price of coffee falls. So let's return that. How is my time, Tomek? Okay. So the idea behind fair trade is very attractive, and I think that if there's one point on which we agree today, the point is that poverty is a problem, and it is a problem that we need to be working to address. And I think our only difference is in the details. The difference is in the technique of how to help poverty, because I think we both want to help the world's poorest people have better lives than they currently have. So maybe we disagree in the method, but I don't think we disagree on the objective. The goal of fair trade coffee, as Borys has mentioned, is to help with this problem of price fluctuation. And so when the prices of coffee do plummet, fall dramatically, like they did at end of 1990s with too much coffee, the problem was too much, there's a guaranteed minimum price that coffee growers receive. Now, it's, as has been pointed out already, The guarantee is not for all coffee growers. The coffee growers have to have fair trade agreement, and fair trade agreement requires a small cooperative of coffee growers. So even though most of the coffee we drink is grown on large plantation, it's not eligible for fair trade protection. Only small farmers and...
It's not exactly true.
Okay, then clarify.
Right now?
Sure.
Okay. So, as I said, there is a possibility to be our small producer organization, and it's a cooperative of small farmers. And there's another possibility in the flow system. I'm not saying about other systems. Yeah? Fair Trade International right now. To be a plantation, to be a big producer of coffee, tea, etc. And right now there are many such producers. About 20-25% of the production of fair trade goods are made by hired labored organizations, means mostly plantations. And most of them are the plantations of tea, because actually it was easier to establish fair trade standards in tea plantations in India and Sri Lanka, because the standards there were already not so bad. For example, social standards in plantations of Brazilian coffee are much worse. So it's more complicated to establish fair trade standards there. But finish with things you said about coffee and the market.
Mm-hmm. So to bring together then fair trade's goals with the fair trade reality, if fair trade works as intended, then it always guarantees a minimum price. Now, of course, today the minimum is irrelevant because of bad weather again in South America. The prices of coffee are very, very high, maybe 30-year high.
Yeah, probably.
Probably about
maybe the highest in the history.
Right. So extremely high prices, and it won't be a surprise then that because of the very high prices, that the cycle that we saw in 1990s will be repeated. Very poor people with no better option will see that coffee now is paying very well, and in countries where coffee growing is possible but not happening today, more coffee growers will be entering the market. Law of supply suggests this. Higher price, people who have no better choice, difficult life, extreme poverty, will see the high price of coffee and begin producing more coffee, just like Vietnam did in 1990s. So the reason that most of the time growing coffee doesn't pay very well is because it's not difficult for poor people with very few choices to begin growing coffee when they see that the price is temporarily high. It happened with Vietnam in 1990s. 50 years before, it happened when Colombia began growing coffee. In the 1930s, Brazil had a valorization program, intentional program to keep the price of Brazilian coffee high. So government policy in 1930s was to buy up surplus and in some cases set fire to extra Brazilian coffee beans in order to keep
or keep in storage for a year or two.
Oh, okay. In order to keep prices high. And it's no surprise then that their South American neighbor Colombia, they saw what Brazil was doing and they realized, oh, there's an opportunity for us to begin growing coffee. And in some ways, Vietnam in 1990s was just like Colombia was in 1930s, 1940s, with a very high price. People who didn't have a better choice began growing coffee because the price went higher. So will fair trade help with poverty? I think am I still okay? I think the question is whether we are asking a short-term question or a long-term question. In the short term, if you give a poor person growing coffee some extra money, it does no harm, right? If anything, they're slightly richer. We pay a little extra for coffee, and hopefully some of that money makes it all the way up the supply chain to the grower we intend to help. But if in the long term it keeps the price of coffee relatively high, especially in downturns, if it keeps the price relatively high, then it will encourage people to continue growing coffee. And growing coffee is noble work, hard work, good work. We appreciate it. I appreciated it just moments ago. But growing coffee will always be a job that never pays very well. And it will never pay very well because it requires few skills, little capital, few machines at the beginning. And especially in the case of Robusta beans, it can be grown many places in the planet, many places on the globe, where there are many, many, many people who are poor. So in the short term, it's possible for fair trade to do some good, especially the premium for things like medical care or education. Those contributions, I think, are very valuable. But if paying a little extra for coffee gives the poorest people with few choices no better option than growing coffee, which will never pay well, then in the long term, it may not be as helpful as other strategies. So my suggested alternative would be, because we do have to care for the poor, as a Christian, I think we must. When you read scripture, we must care for the poor. Again, I think we just differ in the details, in the specifics. I would suggest as an economist that when poor people have better lives, it's almost always because their work becomes more valuable. So investing in NGOs that help with education and with medical care and nutrition and job skills and job training, and even micro-lending, microfinance, so that people with good ideas can acquire the tools that they need for the business they have in mind. I think those things, long term, especially over the long term, will be more effective. So I think it's wonderful. I think it's a wonderful thing to give money to poverty. I think we just question where our money can be most effective. And based on my research, it seems to me that the most effective way to care for the poor is to take the money and not pay extra for coffee, but instead work with an NGO and make generous contributions to NGOs that are helping improve the quality of a person's life so that they can grow coffee if they want to, or they can do something even more valuable if they want to and if they have an opportunity. Thank you.
Do you comment on that, or?
Yes, I would like to comment, because this is probably the one of the most important thing of your research. So I don't like, firstly, I don't like. I agree with some points, especially those which are the comments to the global system in which we are working, we are living right now. But concentrating on coffee, I think, not the best idea, because the coffee in the fair trade system is about 30% of the value of the sales. Of course, it is the biggest one, but it's not the only one. And the practice of fair trade is usually that it promotes developing in many directions. For example, in a plantation which I know from India, in Makaibari, which is producing the famous tea Darjeeling, is the people living there, working there, are establishing new ideas to work, to have other possibilities if the prices of the tea will be very low, or there will be a drought or something else. For example, they develop touristic, they develop a system of microfinances, which you mentioned, in many other purposes. And what is for me bad in saying only about coffee? Not only that the coffee is not the only fair trade product, but also that it's not easy, as you said, to create plantations of coffee. For example, the Vietnam the case there was a case of Colombia, which is the society very close to Brazil. The people were connected, the ideas were more or less the same, and there was a tradition of growing coffee in Colombia in a small scale. So it was just creating bigger scale. For example, in Vietnam, it was much harder, because growing coffee is a very hard thing to do. It's like establishing a dairy system or production of meat in a place where there was never a production of meat. So you have to have educated farmers and many other things to get. In Vietnam, it was possible because of the support of international fundings, especially from the United States. And actually, Vietnam is the only big-scale case that shows us how to create new market, new producers of the coffee on the world. Because other places like Ethiopia, like Tanzania, like Colombia, like Central America, and Brazil, there are places of growing where coffee was growing for a very long time. And finally, I want to go farther than fair trade. I want to tell about the global system, not going very deep in it, because we in Poland are after communist time, and we are rather fair trade and fair economy minded. We are focused about capitalism is good, and it's always good, and more private is also always better. But it's not a. But when we look for the global scale economy and look for supply, demands, the price, and so on, we see there's something wrong about it. You said that the supply is almost always on the same level. It goes a little bit up, it goes a little bit down because of the drought, because of the freeze in Brazil once 10 years, because of new plantations established. But we have to wait for the new coffee at least 4 years. So it's like with apples in Poland, for example. And the demand is also a little bit quite stable. We cannot drink more, we cannot drink less. This is not exactly the truth, because there are new markets like China which are growing rapidly, so the demand is bigger. And even if the price go down, which we observe right now, because the price is going down of the coffee, it probably will not go down so much down as we observed in the beginning of the century. And when we see the fluctuation of the price with the stable supply and stable demand, we can say only, wait a minute, there's something wrong about it. Why the price is different? Why the price is higher one year and lower another year? And this is the question which I would like to ask Mr. Claar. And this is a question which we should answer first, because there is something wrong about the global system. There's someone or some organization, some companies, I don't know, who get big money from the fluctuation of the price. That's my point.
Maybe just a pretty short comment, then we will move further, okay, to ideas behind the fair trade. How is it good or how is it bad? I think it will be something we expect most. The difference you mentioned, how to help poor people. So.
I guess so. Just to comment quickly, one thing to keep in mind is that despite very, very strong marketing efforts, strong efforts of advertising and promotion and marketing, you said that fair trade coffee guaranteed gave a reasonable expectation about the market. But the problem is, at least today, the demand for fair trade coffee and fair trade products is not as large as the supply. So to be very honest, I'll give a very wide range. In a typical year, the coffee that's grown by fair trade growers, they can sell maybe between 10% and half, maybe 10% and half of their crop as fair trade coffee. The rest of their crop that season, there isn't a sufficient demand for fair trade coffee to sell the rest of the coffee. So the rest just ends up dumped into the conventional coffee market. So if you buy some coffee in the shops or you buy some coffee in a restaurant, it may have been grown by a fair trade grower or maybe not, regardless of what the label says, because global demand isn't sufficient in most years to purchase all of the fair trade certified coffee. Now, the fair trade advocates say the problem then is we need more marketing, more promotion, more advertising, and if we can only do that, then we can make sure that the demand is large enough to purchase all the fair trade coffee. But that just begins a cycle. If we do discover that fair trade coffee growers can sell 80% or 90% of their crop, then more and more poor coffee growers who aren't selling fair trade will want access to the fair trade market. So we create incentives for more and more people to grow more and more coffee and produce more and more of the fair trade products. And on one hand, it's a wonderful thing that they have something better to do, but at the same time, it's a shame that they will never do more than grow coffee, because coffee will never pay very well by global standards. Maybe a little better, but not a lot better.
Okay, but what do you think about this? Why the prices are so high right now, and why they were very low a few years ago? What's the main reason of this? Because it's a question still for me.
So I think there are two answers to that question.
Okay.
One is when I say fair trade, what I mean is equal opportunity for everyone. That's what I mean by fair trade. That if I am a producer, it doesn't matter where I live, it doesn't matter who I want to sell to or who I don't want to sell to, the market is level. And so as an American, I'm very sad that in America it's illegal to purchase sugar from countries outside of the United States. And I find that offensive. I think it's bad policy for America, because there are poor sugar growers who would love to sell American sugar, but we tell them, no, it's forbidden, you're not allowed. And I'm convinced that there are parts of Latin America where they are currently growing coffee that would switch and produce sugar instead if only they could get access to the American market where we buy lots and lots of sugar. But instead, it's very unfair.
Probably cheaper.
And probably cheaper. So it's very unfair. We protect already rich American sugar growers and we starve poor sugar growers outside of the United States. And there are, can I finish this one
Sure,
point?
sure.
Okay. And so there are horrible unintended consequences. In the state of Michigan, where I used to live, there was a, do you know the candy, the sweet Lifesaver? You know, it's sweet candy. Okay. There was a factory in Michigan, and they grew these candies, and they had 600 workers in this factory. But of course, they could only get the sugar from the United States. Eventually, the company went, forget that. They closed the factory. They fired 600 people, and they moved to Canada, where they could buy cheaper sugar from international markets. And I think it's very bad policy to have these unfair, very large companies in very rich countries lobbying for very unfair trade in terms of WTO policy and other policies. And I think that poor people everywhere should have access to every market.
It's the same thing with the supporting agriculture, like in European Union. So I agree 100% with this.
In fact, I think I suspect if Americans could grow coffee, it would be illegal to import coffee from other countries. But because we can't, it's not illegal.
My favorite case is the support of United States to growing cotton. And there are only a few big farms in the United States. They're really huge. And they have a support in $1 million each year to produce cheap cotton. And what they do with this cheap cotton? They don't eat it. They send it to China to produce cheap t-shirts. So actually the US government supports cheap China producers.
In fact, it's depending on the laws, how the laws change. The cotton used to all go to China. Now the cotton all goes to Latin America and Caribbean to make T-shirts, depending on what the current laws are like. But yeah, it's terrible. We subsidize rich American farmers when instead we should be helping poor cotton growers elsewhere. So on that point, we agree absolutely.
Okay, Mr. Bińkowski, could you tell us what are the differences between fair trade and free trade to make such a distinction? Could you enlist us several reasons to be a part of the fair trade movement? And how could you encourage us to buy fair trade coffee, fair trade other products? What's good in it?
Okay, maybe I will start with the first one, and then you remind me the second question. Okay, free trade and fair trade. Well, I must say that I was on the last visit of Victor in Poland. It was in Wrocław, in my place, and I heard the lecture, which I think the aim was telling that the fair trade is not exactly free trade. Am I right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So, on the beginning, I agreed. Because it's like a regulation. It's like a law. But it's not obligatory. And after a month, I had a small lecture for the same students. We were talking about the fair trade, about many things about it, and to my great surprise, all of them, or at least most of them, except the professor on the beginning, except the local professor in Wrocław, Mr. Kwaśnicki, told me that there's nothing against free trade in fair trade, because it's not a regulation which is obligatory. It's free to join. So actually it's an idea of free market, and then I realized they're right. There is a regulation, so this is something against the idea, but not the practice, I think. Maybe you would like to say something about it before we skip to another question.
Sure, I can. Yeah, that's exactly right. Fair trade is all voluntary.
Yes.
It's voluntary to join. If you're a coffee grower, it's voluntary to, if you're a company in the West, to sell the coffee. Everything is voluntary. But growing fair trade coffee isn't free.
No sparkling water? Water, yes?
No.
Okay.
Czyli nie
No to nie. Przepraszam.
We'll cut this part.
Are we okay? So, but because fair trade is a good thing, if you're a poor coffee grower, fair trade guarantees a minimum price for at least some of your crop, then many coffee growers are interested in making application to grow coffee. And the last time I looked, FLO required from beginning to end about maybe $3,000 US, 3,000, 4,000 for application.
It depends on the scale.
Right.
But it's usually it's about from $500 for a small organization like 50 people to let's say it's 500 euros to for about 4,000 euros for big scale organizations collecting a few thousand people. So 500 euros, it's not a very small amount of money, but if you divide it to 50 people, it's like 10 euros each. So even in a poor country, it's not something that they cannot afford. Sometimes there are some programs that these local organizations work with other organizations in developed countries, and those organizations give them money to get the certification.
In fact, that's the very beginning of the fair trade coffee was in Netherlands. There was an international Christian aid organization called Solidaridad, and they helped some Mexican coffee growers in the Mexican state of Oaxaca find potential buyers in the Netherlands, and without the work of Solidaridad to establish the very first fair trade brand, the Max Havelaar label in Netherlands, then those Mexican coffee growers and those coffee consumers in Netherlands never would have found each other. So one of the successes of fair trade is that it does help connect potential buyers to potential sellers who might never find each other otherwise. And so I think there is some value in fair trade initiative, and the value is helping potential buyers do business with potential sellers. And when that connection happens, and that was the very beginning of Max Havelaar label in Netherlands, then that I think is good.
But what about the free trade and fair trade? As you said, the fair trade, it's not free. So
It's
because in my opinion, my experience, when the coffee prices, if we talk about coffee, are high, many coffee growers stopped selling coffee with the fair trade brand. And for me, it's okay, because they still have a fair trade standards. They don't use child labor, they don't do slavery, they pay, maybe they don't always pay their workers for the minimum wage, but all others standards are the same, because we don't change the business model so very quickly.
If I can ask, because you told that fair trade is free, so and it's not obligatory, but could you guarantee that ever any government will make a law which obligated people to buy fair trade products? We don't have these promises, so the tendency in the world is to kill the free market economy, to kill the free market between the countries. So maybe in one day, in the next few years, we will see the lobby of fair trade movement to pass the law which obligated, for example, in France, in Poland, that okay, now we start people persuade to buy only fair trade products.
Or just support.
Or to support, yeah. So.
Sure. I understand the question. Well, for me, there's no free economy on the world. There are always regulatory. Regulatory about for example, in 19th century, one of the first United Kingdom law that regulates the labor standards in the factories of cotton was that they cannot get 12-year-old children to work in the factories. And another law in the same act was that children up of the 12 years cannot work more than 12 hours. So it's like, it was actually like a slavery this time. But still, some of the members of the parliament were saying this is against freedom of economy. Right now we are not so much against the laws and the regulatory that says there's no possibility to work in factories for children and other laws. But there is only one state, one country in the world which economy is completely free, because there is no state regulatory. You know which one? Somalia. There's no state. And of course we can say some of the countries have less regulatory, like the United States has less than, for example, France, and its growth is bigger than France. But on another hand, there's a bigger chance of collapse of economy. If we say about is it possible to bring the law, to create the law that strongly supports the fair trade movement, or
real free trade, real fair trade is a free trade. Free trade is a really fair trade. And now, coming to the fairness, we can talk about transactions. The free transaction is the most fair transaction. Free transaction between people. St. Thomas Aquinas, if I recollect correctly, said that the most just transaction is the one that is done freely on the condition that each of the parties making the transaction agrees to, on the condition they agree to. So this is the free trade between the parties. Now, if any party from outside comes and say, no, you are not allowed to do this without giving us, or giving me a dollar, giving me some commission, this is not a fair trade. So if we have a intermediary, like the organization that wants to control the trade between people, they don't do they don't promote really free and fair trade. They don't promote the fair trade. The
Well-
fair trade is there if there is a free exchange, free and benevolent exchange between parties. Now, from your book, I got the impression that you questioned the motives and the intentions of these organizations, of these entities that impose or ask for the commission on this, on the making the access to this free trade arrangements, the so-called free trade, fair trade arrangements. So I think that these motives and the commissions that this organization is taking is not the indication of really fair solutions. How would you comment on this?
Let me respond to both comments. In most cases, because the fair trade market is voluntary. If you're a coffee grower, you can apply to sell fair trade or not. It might be difficult to find someone to buy your coffee because the market is so saturated with fair trade coffee. It might be difficult to find a Western company willing to buy your coffee because there's already so much fair trade coffee. But it's voluntary to enter and pay application fee, and assuming you can find a buyer, that's voluntary. In the United States and most countries, you have the option. You can buy the fair trade coffee or not and pay a little extra for the fair trade coffee. So because the fair trade demand is not extremely strong, there have been efforts to have some exclusive purchasing deals. So for example, there is now an American university where the only coffee served on the campus is certified fair trade coffee. And of course they had a wonderful publicity for this change, now that they were selling only fair trade coffee, and it was voluntary. But now it means that every cup of coffee that's purchased when you are a student or a professor at this university is certified fair trade. So, but again, still voluntary, but an effort to have more exclusive agreements. But in terms of whether fair trade coffee is totally free and totally voluntary, I think we could debate that point slightly, since most countries in Europe offer a subsidy to each country's fair trade organization. So if a government is using the people's money involuntarily to subsidize the fair trade effort, then it's not entirely voluntary. There is some force, and the force is through power of taxation to subsidize the fair trade companies because the demand isn't quite large enough.
Well, that's true, that many governments support not the selling, but education, mostly, because all those supporting, financial supporting from European Union and other local and global organizations goes to educating people about the global economy and also about the fair trade movement. Of course, we can say it's supporting fair trade. That's clear. And the question is, does it good? We can probably agree that the fair trade is good in short, at least in a short distance for producers. Mr. I'm sorry, I forgot.
Yes.
I forgot your name. Forgot your name.
Jan Małek.
Mr. Jan Małek said that about free trade, but for me, the thing that we have right now is not free, and we could say fair trade is also not free. But the ideas of Milton Friedman, which creates part of this global economy, and he was free-minded guy, goes to this place where we cannot say that the buyer and the seller agree on a good and fair price, because the seller is usually getting much lower price than he's supposed to get. This is the I always focus on the practice, not on the methodology, and not on the ideas, not on the philosophy, but on the practice. In the practice, I can see that this system is not working well for the poorest, and I can see that the fair trade is working well for the poorest. I don't know if long or short distance, but even if it's working good in short distance, it's okay. If it's not going to work in long distance, we should think right now about how to change it, how to transform it, how to creating the state that the all trade on the world will be free and fair.
Okay,
It reminds me a little bit the issue of the minimum wage. Minimum wage serves some poor people, it serves, but not most others who have no wage at all. It doesn't serve them at all. It's just the opposite. So it puts more people outside of this minimum wage. So it's, as you're right. If the fair trade organization serves some people, but only individuals, all the others are excluded, and they suffer indirectly. Now another remark regarding the fair trade. I think that the organization could do a lot of good work indicating, promoting the idea of a free trade between international free trade between countries. Poor countries, Africa or in Southern America, cannot export the goods to rich countries of the West because there are tariffs, there are various barriers that prevent the export of free trade. This is what you mentioned about the sugar. There are other products, agricultural products, that are also subject to these restrictions. And the poor people of Africa, as I said, the poor countries cannot export this. It is to the detriment of all the people, because it wasn't important. If you want to import something, you have to pay also. So finally, all the people, both in the poor countries and the rich countries, suffer. Only the government make money. Governments make money.
Oh, and just to make one comment on an earlier point. It's not the absence of government that guarantees free trade and free opportunity. It's a basic system of rule of law. So government in a completely lawless land, then nothing is ever yours, and there are no basic protections of human freedoms, and human rights, and private property. And so the answer is not complete lawlessness with no government. The answer is a small government that treats every human being equally, whether that person is rich or poor, regardless of as little bribery and corruption as possible, and that a guarantee that if people work honestly to create value, then that value is theirs, and that it won't be forcibly taken by their neighbor or by a government. So complete freedom isn't lawlessness and no government. It's small government that protects our basic human rights.
Well, I agree, okay, just short comment. I agree, and in my opinion, if all the governments on the world would be effective in creating laws and checking how the law works, then we would not need the fair trade.
My comment to this question, because I agree with the opinion that we do not have free trade in the world. That should also be my question, but we discussed that already. And So for me, it's not really. Does it really make sense to discuss the differences between free trade and fair trade? Because we do not, if we do not have free trade, it's more the discussion between fair trade and the trade that already exists. And then, if we discuss about these two kinds of trade right now. Even if this fair trade will become more unfair trade because of the subventions, for example, the question is what in this process of fair trade, what is the role of consumers? Because we are speaking about the suppliers, yes. We are discussing about the people who are selling the products, but the fair trade, how it makes influence on the consumers. Because perhaps if in this long-term fair trade functioning in the world, because perhaps one of the positive parts of this will be the changing of state of mind of consumers, and perhaps it's also the sense of fair trade, yes, of the people who are buying the products, that they will think about the sense of the fair trade idea. So my question is how does it influence the consumers?
Is it a question to me?
Perhaps to you,
Oh, is
and then
that- okay.
I will wait for the comment.
Well, for consumers, consumers get a few things. I think talking about the role of consumers in fair trade is also talking about the role of consumers in all trade, in all buying, because consumers who buy fair trade are thinking consumers. They also usually buy organic products, local products if they can. They buy better products, better quality products, and so on, so on. And they do not buy so-called junk food, for example. So this is the bigger idea in which fair trade is just a part. But telling about only fair trade is that consumers get not only the satisfaction that they support by buying, for example, chocolate, the child labor, as I said, but they have also usually better quality. Usually the coffee which is sold under the fair trade mark is coffee which we can correspond to very high quality coffee. The same with chocolate, the same with tea, and so on. So there were some ideas to create fair trade products with low quality, but it didn't work. Because the same people who wanted to buy fair trade wanted to buy good quality products. And this is the answer. The quality is the second one. The first one is the being fair, feeling fair.
Okay.
Okay, it doesn't correspond really with your what you said, because you said that 10% of fair trade products are sold, and then 94%, and the rest is the rest is sold as normal products. I mean, not in the fair trade. So, as a consumer, I can if I really want to have good quality, I will see if it's good quality from fair trade or for another trade.
So I can talk about my personal experience, not theory, but again, reality. I enjoy coffee. I buy coffee, first of all, based on whether I like it or not. And sometimes that coffee is fair trade labeled, and sometimes it is not. One of my favorite coffees in the world is made by the biggest fair trade company in the United States. Biggest fair trade buyer in the US is a company called Equal Exchange. And Equal Exchange began in 1980s. Until 1980s, there had been an international coffee agreement to keep prices high. There was a quota system in place. And at end of Cold War, the international coffee agreement fell apart. And so coffee prices fell rapidly. And Equal Exchange began. They are located in the American state of Massachusetts. Equal Exchange began by exploiting a trade loophole while the United States had a very unfair trade embargo against the Latin American state of Nicaragua. And so this new company, Equal Exchange, began importing coffee to help poor coffee growers in Nicaragua who had unfairly been cut off from the market because of American trade policy and embargo. But Equal Exchange today is the biggest fair trade coffee seller in the United States. And keep in mind, companies like Equal Exchange, they are not operating not-for-profit. They are for-profit companies. And the way that they are able to earn some money for themselves and create jobs not only in coffee-growing countries but also in the American state of Massachusetts is by convincing us that buying fair trade coffee is an important thing to do. And so what I do personally is I buy the coffee that I like the best, sometimes from Equal Exchange, sometimes from Starbucks, and it's not fair trade most of the time. I buy the coffee that I like, and then I sit down with my family and we decide how much money we want to give directly to organizations that we know are doing the work, improving lives, improving nutrition, working against malaria, working for simple medical treatment for worms in poor children who have distended abdomens. We give our money generously to those organizations that we know are helping change lives. And one of the things and I'll close on this, one of the things that I mentioned in the book is, again, my personal experience. There was one coffee shop that I liked very much when I lived in Michigan. And at this coffee shop, you had a choice. You could buy fair trade coffee or coffee that was not fair trade. And for a cup of coffee like this, they charged, if it was fair trade, maybe one extra zloty, one extra if it's fair trade. But if you do the simple arithmetic, if every time they make one cup, which requires not much coffee, they take one extra zloty from me, then coffee growers should be getting much more than guaranteed US $1.25 per pound. They should be getting much more. So is fair trade honorable? I think the intent is honorable, but the reality sometimes is that caring consumers contribute extra money, but that money doesn't make it all the way to the farmers that we're trying to help. And I would argue that when I give $1 to an NGO that I know is doing good work, that dollar goes farther when I do it directly rather than when I do it indirectly by paying a little extra for coffee. Because the arithmetic, it doesn't add up.
Okay, let me ask last question, and then there will be time for the questions from the audience.
Can I have a short comment?
Okay, sure.
Okay, so the idea is, well, I also give money, this 1% we can get from our taxes to humanitarian action, which helps people in Sudan, Polish humanitarian action. And I think they do a great job. I know people from there. But right now we are talking not, I've got the feeling that if the fair trade is good or not. We're talking if it is the best or is the worst. If the giving money to the societies, to the foundations that help people, poor people, is not a better way. And I cannot find an answer for this. But my feeling is that giving the money to charity organizations is giving them fish, or at least the fishing stick, yeah, but the fair trade is to teaching these people how to do the fishing stick, and this is the difference. I don't know what is better. I'm just feeling that fair trade is better, but I'm not sure about it.
Okay, having heard that, and also what Mr. Bińkowski said before, that fair trade helps the poor or the poorest. Professor Claar, could you, according to what you wrote in your book, give us maybe 3 reasons and briefly describe them why, in your opinion, fair trade doesn't work? Because we heard about the goals, about helping the poorest. Now let's maybe put attention to the reality. What's the difference between goals and reality?
You want 3 reasons, right?
Yeah, maybe 3 main or...
Fair trade, so to summarize, fair trade is, at least currently, it's not very large. Again, maybe 10 to 50%, leaving a large trade is actually sold as fair trade. So it's not very large. I would also argue that for each dollar that we pay, very few of those dollars actually go to the people we're trying to help. Some of the monies go to the companies that are buying the fair trade coffee, mostly for marketing and advertising. In the United States, everyone recognizes the Equal Exchange logo, their corporate logo. It's an arrow pointing down and an arrow pointing up, and everyone recognizes this. So they spend a lot of money on marketing. And then a lot of the monies also then go to administration and regulation. If we guarantee that when you buy a bag with the Fair Trade logo, that it's been produced under guaranteed conditions, then someone has to be paid to go out and make sure that those obligations are being fulfilled. Otherwise, we can never know. So the money is, fair trade isn't as big as it could be. Also, the monies that go to fair trade aren't going directly to the people that we're trying to help. And then 3 reasons, eh? I think the final reason is growing coffee is honorable work. It's important work. I'm thankful for the people who supply coffee for me to wake up every morning. I'm very thankful for this. But growing coffee is a job that will never pay very well. It will never pay very well. And so making an investment in helping people move out of producing coffee into things that will pay better, I think, is a more important goal. It's the goal we have for our children, right? Not to have lives that were the same as ours, but to help them get better education and better opportunities to have lives that are better than ours. And if we can give them the tools in order to do that and move beyond things like growing coffee, then I think that's a wonderful success.
Any questions?
Maybe only one comment to what Mr. Bińkowski told about the children law in Great Britain in 19th century, that you told that it was something good for them. Maybe it could be some misunderstanding, because in these days, in 19th century, what was the alternative for these children which couldn't work at the factory? So we don't know what was the answer. So probably in that time, it was only one way to rescue the life for these children, to work and get a little money to not be hungry, for example, because there was no social service, there was no social laws. So telling as an example of good law, I think it's some misunderstanding, because at that time this law was very bad for children. Exactly.
This is a good question, and I have an answer to this, because the same more or less the same situation like then in the United Kingdom is right now with the plantations of cocoa in Ivory Coast. There are children on these plantations. And this is bad. Nobody here will say this is good, especially that they don't have paid for this. This is child slavery, one of the worst things on this world. And then, and now in this system, and then in United Kingdom, it was not the problem that 100% of the society was poor. It was the problem that 90% of the society was poor, and the 10% so-called gentlemen were very rich. And 1% of these gentlemen were very, very, very rich. And right now, we are not talking only about the law that that can probably assure the increase of the poverty of these children. But we are talking also about changing the idea how the economy works and how the rich people are getting richer and poor people are getting poorer. And right now we are talking how to change it. And in my opinion, fair trade is one of the way to change it. And there are many other ways, like what we said, cutting the subsidies for agriculture.
You mentioned that the richer get richer, and the rich people get richer, and the poor people get poorer. This is a myth. If we have the free economy, we have in Western countries, we have poor, but the poorer get always richer when the economy is growing, and in free countries it is so that the poor people get richer. In socialist countries, it's a different story. It may be. So this is a myth saying that in America, for example, or in France, or in Western Union, European Union, the rich people get richer and the poor get poorer. It's not right. Maybe the difference grows, but as long as the poor gets richer, it's fine. In fact, if you compare what was in the 19th century, the percentage of the poor people were, say, 90% of the total global population. Now it is about 20% only, 25%. So it is a progress.
Yeah, may I comment on that point?
Yes.
If you look at, I agree with you, in a free society, it's possible for inequality to exist, but history is also very clear that the poor grow wealthier. In the example that I know the best in the United States, there are still poor Americans, but compared to 300 years ago, they are rich, incredibly rich. It's one of the reasons why many of today's global poor will risk everything, including their lives, to be a poor person in America, because being a poor person in America is better than being a poor person elsewhere. And so we talk about regulation and unfairness. I would be in favor of much more liberal immigration policies. I live in the United States because my great-great-grandparents were able to move there and move there freely. And I think that it's not very nice that we have very difficult immigration restrictions into the United States. I think that resources would be used more effectively, and people on average would have better lives if they could choose freely where they want to live and try to earn a living. And I think immigration policy is unfair.
Well, and my opinion is that in some situations, increasing the income of the society, it's always good for the poor. But in many cases, like in South America, like it was during the time of junta in Brazil, Argentina, or Chile, the poor people were getting poorer because of so-called free economies. And what is clear and what is obvious that in a free society, free economies, the differences between the rich and the poor, even if the poor are getting a little bit richer, increase dramatically. And what happened if it increased more and more and more? There's coming revolution. The history is clear about it. It always was like this.
Okay, if in the free country the rich people produce and the poor people have also the opportunity to produce, then the wealth grows. Why many countries remain poor? Because the economic system is wrong, is bad, and they are dictatorships, they are socialism, and this is the reason that they remain poor, unfortunately. And for example, in Argentina now, Argentina was a very rich country, and it has a lot of, natural resources, but now it gets poorer and poorer because of the system, because of the dishonesty of the politicians, of the socialists, of this antagonistic behavior against people who succeeded.
And you mentioned Chile. Chile is almost a unique case study. When I was a child, I think everyone thought that poor people in Chile were oppressed and taken advantage of. And to see now Chile succeeding and growing, I think it's remarkable that just in my lifetime alone, they've had so many advances.
But in your childhood, there was a time of Pinochet. And this was not, it was the junta, yes, but it was also the free economy.
I wouldn't argue that the Chilean country of my childhood was a free country with a free market.
Well, we agreed that there's no free market, free economy in any country in the world. But some of them are more free and some of them are more socialist.
When I speak of freedom, I speak of basic human rights. And any government that stands in the way of anyone's choices and opportunities is not a free market.
Okay.
Another question.
Let's back to the fair trade, yes.
You told us about two examples of American government restrictions. First about this company which was closed and moved to Canada, and the second one about the cotton. And when I hear such examples, always I want to ask, why does the government make such stupid things? And because if everyone knows about this, or even if people, professors or something, knows about something like this, so I suppose that the government people always consult such things, or should know also what to do. So what is the reason for such handlings that are not in advantage to the United States?
One of the unfortunate realities of democracy is that often economic theory is not politically advantageous. And so if you are a politician in a state with many sugar growers, and Michigan is an example of that, they grow beets, and from the beets you can get sugar. If you were a politician seeking re-election in that state, then you need to keep those sugar growers very happy. And one way to do that is advocate that policy. And even if, suppose, maybe if you're in Michigan, you're just one politician and you will vote for it. If you can make friends with someone in Texas who has many cotton growers, then together you both vote for the cotton sub-protection and also for the sugar protection, and then you continue this process until you have enough votes from different states that are also protecting their own farmers, and it's possible to pass these legislations even though they're bad for American consumers, because then cotton is more expensive, sugar is more expensive, other restricted products are more expensive, and it's also bad for poor people outside of our country. So the problem is that good economic theory sometimes falls by the wayside when elections are close.
I know right now what is the problem in Poland also. Okay.
Well, in my comment you said about the democracy. We used to say that democracy is not the best idea of politics we created, but the best we know. And for me, the fair trade is also something, not the best thing, the best solution for the unfairness in the global market. But for me, it's the best I know. I don't know if you agree or not. Probably not all of you will agree, but that's my opinion.
And I think the job of economists, back to your point, it's interesting and curious that the things that economists understand best, free trade, tax policy, are the parts of government where we've had so little impact, even though we know them the best. But again, the reason is democracy has limitations, and if the will of the people is to be protectionist, then it's difficult to win the argument that free and fair trade is better.
So that's what I meant, of this long and short this term of fair trade. Yes, but I think that the long-term influence will be good on people that buy things. I mean, they will think about the fair trade, the idea of fair trade. Perhaps it's one of the advantages of this idea. It's like not only the part of the sellers, but also the part of the buyers. That perhaps in 30 years they will change the policy of government, because they will have knowledge about the idea of fair trade.
It's already started.
Okay, so
Okay, maybe one last question if there is one. And if not, so thank you very much. I'd like to thank our guests for coming, for giving us an involving debate, our audience for coming, for interesting questions. Thank you very much again, Mr. Borys, for coming and for the discussion. Thank you.